Hey everybody, this is a chapter. I'm probably not going to read this whole book, but this is a chapter from Karl Kautsky and the Socialist Revolution by Massimo Salvadori. The chapter that I'm going to read is titled The Crusade Against Bolshevism. So here we go. Section 1 is titled the quote renegade Kautsky question mark. Although he continued to be involved in party struggles within the German labor movement, after 1918, Kautsky's energies were primarily devoted to an ideological polemic against Bolshevism. Indeed, that may be called his crusade against the domestic and foreign policy of the Soviet state and its leadership was to form the climax of the whole political and ideological career of the man who had seemed, during the period of the Second International, to so many socialist intellectuals, among them Lenin himself, to be the most legitimate theoretical heir of Marx and Engels. The other aspect of Kautsky's activity during the post-1918 period were simply ramifications and articulations of his struggle against Bolshevism. This crusade was pursued in an uninterrupted succession of books and pamphlets, the most important of which were Demokratie oder Diktatur, Die Diktatur des Proletariats, both in 1918, Terrorismus und Kommunismus of 1919, which is on this channel, will be on this channel, Die Internationale, 1920, von der Demokratie zur Staatssklaverei, eine Auseinandersetzung mit Trotzki, published in 1921, Die Proletarische Revolution und ihr Programm, 1922, Die Internationale und Sowjetrussland, 1925, and Der Bolschewism in der Sackgasse, 1930. Even many portions of other works of a general theoretical or historical character, such as his magnum opus of 1927, Die materialistische Geschichte auf Aussang, especially the second volume devoted to the state, and Socialisten und Krieg, published in 1937, were directly related to the struggle against Bolshevism. In addition, Kautsky's collaboration with the Review of Austrian Social Democracy, Der Kampf, and with the Berlin journal Die Gesellschaft was in large measure devoted to the same theme. It is well known, of course, that after Kautsky presented in The Dictatorship of the Proletariat, which actually repeated arguments that had already been set down in Democracy or Dictatorship, and Terrorism and Communism, those theses which were to constitute the ideological arsenal of his polemic against the new Bolshevik regime, the two major architects of the October Revolution, Lenin and Trotsky, both took the field against Kautsky's position. Lenin, with his celebrated work, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, published in 1918, the latter in his own Terrorism and Communism, published in 1920. As indicated by the very title of the former work, both Lenin and Trotsky charged that Kautsky was a, quote, renegade. In other words, that Kautsky had betrayed not only the revolutionary conceptions of Marx, but his own past as well. Lenin wrote that Kautsky had to, quote, resort to trickery literally at every step to cover up his apostasy, end quote. That the, quote, renegade Bernstein, end quote, seemed, quote, a mere puppy compared to the renegade Kautsky, end quote. Footnote. See Lenin Collected Works, Volume 28. End footnote. Both Lenin and Trotsky counterposed the revolutionary Kautsky of Der Weg zur Macht, published in 1909, to the later, quote, renegade. Trotsky in particular reminded Kautsky that in 1909 he had written, quote, "It was Marx and Engels who formulated the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which Engels stubbornly defended in 1891, shortly before his death, the idea that the political autocracy of the proletariat is the only form in which it can realize its control over the state." End quote. Trotsky. In reality, by formulating their case against Kautsky in terms of his, quote, apostasy, Lenin and Trotsky were speaking the political language of party struggle, and not without considerable difficulty. Kautsky had indeed been a protagonist of the theoretical struggle against revisionism. Lenin himself had called him, quote, the chief of German revolutionaries, end quote, and had manifested the most unbounded admiration for Kautsky's method of scientific analysis, in which he said, quote, the method of Marx, end quote, lived again. On the other hand, the Bolsheviks considered themselves the only consistent revolutionary Marxists, compelled now to confront both Kautsky's, quote, revolutionary past and his present position as an implacable opponent of the October Revolution and the tactics that had brought the Bolsheviks to power. They sought to, quote, fracture the continuity of this work. In support of their political and ideological case, Lenin and Trotsky pointed to the fact that in the past Kautsky had been 1. A champion of the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, 2. A champion of the concept of workers' democracy, 3. A theoretician of the necessity for a class state, 4. An analyst of the inevitable connection between world war and proletarian revolution. Identifying their own conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat, democracy, the state, and the timing and modalities of the revolution with Marxism, and simultaneously registering Kautsky's opposition to Bolshevism, Lenin and Trotsky responded to Kautsky's polemic by denouncing his alleged, quote, renegacy, abandonment of Marxism, vulgar liberalism, humanitarianism, pusillanimous democratism. Thus, according to Lenin, the man he had previously considered a peerless master of the Marxist method now became a dreary and mediocre schoolmaster, a Philistine chewer of the cud of counter-revolutionary vulgarity. In reality, the basis for the change that there had been, the charge that there had been a, quote, apostasy, end quote, was exceedingly frail, if indeed it had any basis at all. I should look up apostasy, because I feel like I know what it means, but apostasy is the act of abandoning or renouncing a religion or adopting an opinion that goes against one's previous religious beliefs. In reality, the basis of the charge that there had been a, quote, apostasy was exceedingly frail, if indeed it had any basis at all, for the positions Kautsky had developed precisely during the period in which Lenin considered him a, quote, master, and the quote, chief of German revolutionaries, end quote, were all such as to lead him inevitably to the sharpest opposition, both to the tactics and strategies of the Bolsheviks in the seizure of power, and to the manner in which they established their dictatorship after it. It is, of course, indisputable, as we have shown, that Kautsky's positions did gradually shift in a moderate direction, but it is also undeniable that this shift occurred within the framework of a general conception of socialism, democracy, and the state which was, from the very outset, taking the Erfurt program as its fundamental starting point, of such a character as to be irreconcilable with the theory of dictatorship and of the state on which the Bolsheviks acted in 1917. Kautsky could be accused of immobility, but not of having abandoned the fundamental lines of his conception of the revolutionary process, the dictatorship of the proletariat and the socialist state. When Trotsky reproached Kautsky with the fact that in 1909 he had still, quote, correctly acknowledged the dictatorship of the proletariat, he was in fact misinterpreting a purely verbal formula. Kautsky had indeed spoken of, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, of the exclusive power of the proletariat, but Kautsky did so in the context of a conception of the revolutionary process that differed qualitatively from that of the Bolsheviks. For Lenin in 1918, the dictatorship of the proletariat was a, quote, power based directly on force and unrestricted by any laws, end quote. Quote, a rule won and maintained by the use of violence by the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, a rule that is unrestricted by any laws, end quote. Lenin. For Trotsky of 1920, quote, he who repudiates terrorism in principle, i.e. repudiates measures of suppression and intimidation of the armed counter-revolution, bracket, here counter-revolution was understood to mean any force that did not accept Bolshevik power, identified with the objective expression of the will of the proletariat, and struggle against counter-revolution to mean the measures directed against all non-Bolsheviks without restraint of law, end bracket. Must renounce any idea of the political supremacy of the working class and reject its revolutionary dictatorship, end quote. Trotsky. In light of these positions, any reference to Kautsky's supposed revolutionary and correct ideas of 1909 was based on purely formal analogies, since Kautsky, when speaking of, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, associated this dictatorship with a revolutionary dictatorship, end quote. Shoot, I fucked that up. Oh, no, I didn't fuck it up. There's a footnote. Fuck up. Where am I? In light of these positions, any reference to Kautsky's supposed revolutionary and correct ideas of 1909 was based on purely formal analogies, since Kautsky, when speaking of, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, associated this dictatorship with a revolutionary dictatorship. Oh no, I think that might be a typo. In the light of these positions, any reference by the Bolsheviks. Yeah, this is weird. What Kautsky meant by the dictatorship of the proletariat was primarily 1. Power obtained by the working class through the conquest of a majority in parliament, i.e. through the exercise of democratic freedoms in competition with all other parties. 2. The reliance of a purely socialist government in transforming the social basis of the state on a parliament that represented all political forces and was controlled by a socialist majority. 3. A regime that would not suppress the political and civil rights of citizens. 4. A regime prepared to verify the basis of popular consent to it in periodic elections. 5. A regime that would use violence only against those advocates of counter-revolution who refused to accept the reality of a socialist majority constituted an illegal government. Ever since 1893, when he had written his book on, quote, parliamentarism, Kautsky had made it clear that he believed that Parliament could be the instrument of the dictatorship either of the bourgeoisie or of the proletariat. That Parliament was an indispensable technical agency, and that the dictatorship of the proletariat flowed in substance from the combination of a socialist parliamentary majority and the functional use of this legislative organ. Moreover, in his 1894 essay titled A Social Democratic Catechism, Kautsky had expounded views on the functions and limits of violence from which Kautsky never thereafter deviated, and which Kautsky reproduced in the letter Der Weg zur Macht. Whatever Kautsky's oscillations in radical or moderate directions may have been, they always remained within a conception of the revolutionary process demarcated by all these points, which were thoroughly incompatible with the Bolshevik conception. Ever since his commentary on the Erfurt program, Kautsky had expressed his aversion to the supporters, like Weitling, of a dictatorship of a minority, and to the sort of, quote, barrack socialism, end quote, Kautsky was later to see in the rule of the Bolsheviks. Lenin accused Kautsky of having abandoned Marxist positions on the state the moment Kautsky refused to acknowledge the validity of Soviets as the foundation of a new type of state. But the, quote, renegade Kautsky could have retorted, with full justification, that his position on this question remained identical to those he had elaborated when he was a, quote, master of Marxism, for not only in his essay of 1893 on, quote, parliamentarism, but also in the agrarian question, he had opposed direct legislation as a utopia that was unrealizable in a great modern state, and he had maintained that socialism would be unable to dispense not only with parliament, but also with an efficient centralized bureaucracy. Although this bureaucracy should be subjected to public control and flanked by autonomous local bodies subject to direct popular will. In sum, the Kautsky who launched the crusade against Bolshevism was a Kautsky who had every right to reject the charge of renegacy hurled by Lenin and Trotsky. When Trotsky wrote that Kautsky, quote, abandoning the idea of a revolutionary dictatorship, transforms the problem of the conquest of power by the proletariat into the problem of the conquest of the majority of votes by the Social Democratic Party in one of the future election campaigns, end quote. Trotsky was counterposing the image of a fictitious Kautsky to what had always been the real Kautsky. There was never any real, quote, apostasy or, quote, betrayal. Rather, two antithetical conceptions of socialism had taken the field against each other. New section. Section 2. Democracy and Socialism. A declaration of principle contained in the dictatorship of the proletariat could be inscribed as an epigraph to Kautsky's struggle against Bolshevism. Quote, our final goal, correctly understood, consists not in socialism, but in the abolition of any form of exploitation and oppression, be it directed against a class or a party, nation, or race. Parenthesis, Erfurt Program. End parenthesis. End quote. Kautsky, the dictatorship of the proletariat. If socialists had chosen to be such, Kautsky wrote, it was because they were convinced that socialism was the means by which to achieve that goal. Quote, we proposed the socialist form of production as a goal in this struggle because, given present technical and economic conditions, it appears the only means to attain our goal. If it could be shown that we are mistaken, that the liberation of the proletariat and of humanity in general could be achieved only, or more suitably, on the basis of private property and the means of production, as Proudhon thought at one time, then we would have to reject socialism without in any way renouncing our final goal, but rather in the very interest of that goal. End quote. Kautsky, the dictatorship of the proletariat. In practice, Kautsky was of course convinced that socialism was indeed the only way to abolish exploitation and oppression, but Kautsky was concerned to extricate the idea of socialism from an identification with the pure and simple socialization of the means of production, and to introduce a mediation which he considered essential, namely the, quote, democratic method, end quote, and therewith the, quote, democratic organization of society, end quote. In his polemic against the Bolsheviks, Kautsky constantly underlined the decisive importance of this mediation. Without democratic organization, democracy meaning essentially parliamentarism and political and civil liberties, the socialization of the means of production lost its socialist significance, since its management was then entrusted to a despotically organized minority that annulled the meaning socialization acquired in combination with democracy. To maintain, as did the Bolsheviks, that other than democratic methods could be adopted in the name of socialism was to introduce uncontrolled abuses of power. Quote, thus democracy and socialism do not differ in the sense that one is a means and one an end. Both are means to the same end. ... For us, socialism is unthinkable without democracy. By modern socialism, we mean not only a social organization of production, but also a democratic organization of society. For socialism is indissolubly linked to democracy. There is no socialism without democracy. End quote. Kautsky. Dictatorship of the proletariat. Two components were fused in Kautsky's approach. One was an ethical cultural tradition with its roots in liberal humanism. The other, a more distinctly political ideological conception with its roots in an evolutionist conviction that economic development, socialism, and democracy were a sort of indissoluble trinity. The latter was set out, in all its simplicity, in Democracy or Dictatorship, Kautsky's first comprehensive essay against Bolshevism. Quote, "The more capitalistic a state is on the one hand, and the more democratic on the other, the closer that state is to socialism. The further the development of its capitalist industry, the higher its productivity, the greater its wealth, the more socialized is its labor, and more numerous its proletariat. The more democratic a state, the better organized and trained is its working class." End quote. Kautsky, Democracy or Dictatorship. The Bolsheviks' conception of dictatorship, on the contrary, stood opposed to the Marxist method, which posed a historically necessary link between development and socialism. Quote, "Since the dictatorship of the proletariat, which they advocate and implement, is nothing but a grandiose attempt to leap over necessary phases of development and to eliminate them by decree. They maintain that this is the most painless method to create socialism and to, quote, shorten and lessen its birth pangs," end quote. But our experience rather calls to mind, if we want to pursue the analogy, a pregnant woman who leaps madly about to reduce the duration of her pregnancy, which she finds difficult, and thus provokes a premature birth. The result of such behavior is a baby that cannot survive, end quote. Kautsky, Dictatorship and Democracy. Right? Yeah, Democracy or Dictatorship, excuse me. In fact, according to Kautsky's account, the original sin of Bolshevism was much more serious than a mere premature birth. For Kautsky, it was a necessary condition for a healthy gestation that the proletariat be able to mature in a context of adequate capitalist development and of an experience of struggle seasoned by the exercise of political and civil liberties. Since both conditions were lacking in Russia, Bolshevism was not so much a premature child as an abortion. In other words, it was not an insufficiently mature socialism, but a non-socialism. Indeed, Bolshevism created conditions for the proletariat that were worse than those of capitalism, despite the bright red veneer of the Russian regime. Kautsky maintained that if the proletariat did not possess a sufficient level of organizational and ideological development and socio-political experience, or a sufficient numerical strength to assert itself against the other social classes, then socialism would not emerge as a social reality, but only as an abstractly voluntarist project. A socialist party that sought to implement such a project could retain power only by a minority dictatorship. A minority dictatorship in turn could be imposed only by methods of bureaucratic and police control. The end result would be a monstrosity, a regime guided ideologically by a radical socialist party, socially unable to establish socialist relations of production, and politically organized along the lines of an absolute despotic system. The essential problem of modern socialism, according to Kautsky, was the question of what level of maturity was needed for the proletariat to go beyond the class limits of bourgeois political democracy. Kautsky was convinced that in the advanced countries, modern capitalism had now reached the level of development needed for socialization. The problem of power was now a problem of the strength and consciousness of the proletariat. Quote, "There is no reason to believe that in the modern industrial states, with their banks and organizations of capitalists, It is not possible today to organize the greater part of production in a socialist manner through the state, municipalities, and consumer associations. What is of decisive importance is not the material but the subjective element. Is the proletariat strong and intelligent enough to take this social planning into its own hands? In other words, does it possess the ability to extend democracy from the political to the economic system? End quote. Kautsky, The Dictatorship of the Proletariat. Once the necessary economic and social conditions existed, and socialism had acquired socialism's proper foundation in a sufficient expanse of socialist, quote, will among the masses, only a, quote, democratic method could give voice to this, quote, will for socialism. Where am I? Dictatorship of the Proletariat. To take power without testing this will, and testing this will among the entire population, would be to accomplish a coup d'etat and not a social revolution. Nor was it enough that a desire for socialism be expressed by the majority of the proletariat alone. If that class was still a minority of the population, for then, as in Russia, the proletariat would find itself from the outset in extremely difficult conditions in relation to all other social classes, above all the peasant masses. If the workers constituted a minority, this meant that the level of economic development was insufficient, and the will for socialism itself therefore a mere abstract voluntarism. The Bolsheviks mistakenly believed that they were acting in accordance with history, since they had won over the majority of the proletariat, the vanguard class. Thus they thought that they could establish, quote, democracy only for the working class, a, quote, proletarian democracy, without seeing the general implications of the fact that they could not obtain an adequate consensus from the entire body of society. The result had been to set in motion, independent of any will, a process of degeneration of the entire Bolshevik system of power, inevitably transforming the proletariat into an armed aristocracy incapable of emancipating the rest of society by itself. The dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, the suppression of universal suffrage, the introduction of a system of different weighting of the votes of industrial workers and of peasants, the election of the highest leading bodies through various levels of indirect suffrage, the construction of a bureaucratic police machine to control the majority of the population, which had been denied any real power in the political system, all these constituted successive steps in a process that had culminated in Bolshevik, quote, despotism. Lenin objected to what he called Kautsky's, quote, vulgar liberalism, insisting that Marxists, when approaching the question of democracy, could not, quote, proceed from the relation between the majority and the minority, end quote, but from, quote, the relation between the exploited and the exploiters, end quote. Lenin. Only by starting from the relationship between exploited and exploiters, Lenin argued, was it possible to understand the necessity for a, quote, class democracy and a dictatorship against class enemies. Hence the opportunist nature of any argument to the effect that democracy was a general method of regulating relations among all classes. Kautsky's opposition to Lenin's approach rested on his contention that in a political system that claimed not to be despotic, the character of a government was determined by the relations between those who actually govern and the social forces that are governed, and by the possibility of verifying the degree of consent commanded by the former among the latter. Such consent, even where it initially existed, was not necessarily granted once and for all. Its expression required a formal system of control independent of the force to be judged and controlled, namely the government itself. For Kautsky, this was the basis of a democratic system. By contrast, the summary identification of the working class with the Bolsheviks and the Soviet government was an ideological operation designed to legitimize a ruling party without democratic controls by the false claim that the working class itself was governing in Russia. But could a class itself govern directly? Kautsky's answer was unequivocal. To say that a class governs is nonsense. A, quote, class can rule but not govern, since a class is an indeterminate mass. Only an organization can govern, end quote. What governs is a party or a coalition of parties. Now, quote, a party is nevertheless not the same thing as a class, even though a party represents primarily a class interest, end quote. Kautsky. Democracy or dictatorship. Here there was a further complication. It must be kept in mind that a party represented a class because of a certain policy. That is, it proposed choices and decisions that could be considered positive or negative. Quote, a class interest, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, or even the class interest can be represented in very different ways by different tactical methods, end quote. Finally, the relationship between classes and parties appeared in its full complexity when it was recalled that, quote, a class can be divided among various parties, end quote, and that, quote, a party can include members of different classes, end quote. This was what made it possible for the same ruling class to aspire to a change in its governmental representation when its, quote, majority believes that the method of the party that is hitherto governed has become unsatisfactory and that of its competitor more suitable, end quote. Kautsky, democracy or dictatorship. Only respect for the rules of the contest between minority and majority could satisfy such exigencies. A government like that of the Bolsheviks, which ignored and concealed the problems inherent in the relations between classes and parties, by claiming that one revolutionary party objectively represented the interests of the entire working class, and therefore that the class itself was governing directly through the party, was inevitably led to mystify its own dictatorship as the dictatorship of the proletariat. In his reply, Lenin maintained that Kautsky's insistence on the vital necessity to respect the majority-minority relationship was simply a reiteration of the point of view of bourgeois democracy. Yet when the October Revolution occurred, Lenin himself had indicated the following principles as necessary elements of democracy, albeit within a system of Soviets. 1. Acceptance of the principle that government parties could be replaced as one of the rules of the, quote, democratic game. 2. Transfer of government responsibilities from one party to another in a peaceful manner according to the results of elections in the Soviets. 3. Therewith acknowledgement that the toiling mass classes, the workers and peasants, were represented by a plurality of parties. In the appeal of the Central Committee of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, Bolsheviks, dated 5th to 6th November 1917, Lenin had written that because of the revolution, quote, the transfer of government power from one Soviet party to another is guaranteed without any revolution, simply by a decision of the Soviets, simply by new elections of deputies to the Soviets, end quote. Lenin. Polemicizing in The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, however, Lenin introduced the qualitatively different, objectivist argument that the Bolsheviks constituted the only force genuinely capable of representing the masses and their historic needs. When Kautsky spoke of various Russian parties that could represent the masses in a manner different from the government party, he was thinking primarily of the Mensheviks, which he considered the most authentically Marxist party, and the social revolutionaries. Socialist revolutionaries is generally how people refer to it. I think social revolutionary gives some kind of, diminishes their commitment to socialism. According to Lenin, on the contrary, the development of the revolution had demonstrated that the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries were socialist parties only in name. In substance, they were petty bourgeois democratic parties. Consequently, Lenin could object that when Kautsky came forward as the champion of the rights of the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, he was, quote, guided by their name, that is, by a word, not by the actual place they occupy in the struggle between the proletariat and bourgeoisie, end quote. Lenin. It was this real alignment, Lenin argued, that deprived Kautsky's hypothesis of the peaceful transfer of power from one Soviet party to another of any significance. For the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries had objectively proven themselves non-Soviet parties. In sum, the role of the Bolsheviks as the sole governmental force was linked to a conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat as founded on force and independent of any law. Parenthesis. It is clear, in fact, that a representative government, even in the context of a system based solely on Soviet parties, would have required that such a dictatorship be founded on law and on the verification of popular consent through contest between majority and minority. End parenthesis. The situation in Russia led Kautsky to the conclusion that the, quote, dictatorship of only one of these parties is, in that event, no longer the dictatorship of the proletariat, but the dictatorship of one portion of the proletariat over the other. End quote. Kautsky, dictatorship of the proletariat. Furthermore, the dictatorship of a party could not assert itself technically except by relying directly on an organization enabling the minority to rule over a disorganized society. Thus, Kautsky declared, the only road available to the Bolsheviks was the route of Bonapartism, quote, to govern by virtue of the superiority of a centralized organization over the unorganized popular masses, and by virtue of the superiority of its armed forces, end quote. Kautsky, dictatorship of the proletariat. The inevitable outcome of any use of organized and systematic violence to regulate social relations was a Caesarist structure culminating in a personal dictatorship. Then the, quote, revolution necessarily leads to the rule of a Cromwell or a Napoleon, end quote. As a minority dictatorship marching down the road to Caesarism, the Russian Revolution was assuming bourgeois features. In Kautsky's view, the explanation for the genesis of the Bolsheviks' conception of dictatorship as coercion exercised by the ruling party lay at once in the very manner of their seizure of power, and in the difficulties encountered in the exercise of this power. The Bolsheviks had been able to triumph not because of their own strength, but because of the disruption of the social fabric by the action of an element that was neither proletarian nor socialist, the peasant rabble, which in Russia, unlike the developed countries, still constituted, quote, an element of rebellion, end quote. However, the peasants, having attained their own ends, now represented a politically, quote, apathetic force. Thus favored by the weakness of the provisional government and by the effects of the war, the Bolsheviks had been able to take power with a coup d'etat. But after the seizure of power, Russian backwardness turned against the Bolsheviks, who found that they now lacked, quote, all the preconditions for the accomplishment of their own aims, end quote. Having come to power without the consensus of the majority, the Bolsheviks henceforward had to administer power without sufficient popular support or an adequate modern economy. Thus the Bolsheviks found it necessary to abandon the democratic road, in which the Bolsheviks had believed not long ago, and became the theoreticians of dictatorial methods in the normal exercise of power. At this point, however, the Bolsheviks were gripped by an insuperable contradiction. Although they were the most radical party of socialism, they could retain power only through the most reactionary bourgeois methods and could not overcome the difficulties engendered by economic and social backwardness. Having come to the forefront of the revolution as the most socialist party, the Bolsheviks were condemned to a maximum divergence from their initial promises. But this divorce between theory and practice made it too dangerous for the Bolsheviks to proceed to any verification of popular consent. They therefore adopted the only available alternative, the constitution of a bureaucratic dictatorship through which they intended to avoid any democratic verification indefinitely. Quote, "The absolute rule of the bureaucracy," end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, "has its foundation in the hypothesis of rule without end, the violent repression of any opposition to its governing principle," end quote. Kautsky, Democracy or Dictatorship. Bolshevism, Kautsky declared, departed from socialism the moment Bolshevism decided to dissolve the Constituent Assembly and imposed, in place of a representative assembly founded on equal, direct, and secret universal suffrage, an assembly founded on, quote, "unequal, indirect, public, and limited suffrage, elected by privileged categories of workers, soldiers, and peasants," end quote. Kautsky, Democracy or Dictatorship. For Kautsky, this not only constituted a violation of universal democratic principles, but also plunged the Bolshevik government into a situation that was intractable, even from the standpoint of class democracy. In fact, any class democracy was untenable. He held, because the suppression of democracy for enemy classes led inevitably to the construction of a mechanism of authoritarian control that impinged even on the politically privileged classes, within which dissent would be deemed a concession to non-revolutionary points of view. The Bolsheviks had rejected political democracy because the Bolsheviks considered it inadequate to liberate the proletariat. The Bolsheviks were thereby impelled to consider political democracy itself something to be combated. The Marxist attitude, Kautsky argued, had been and remained quite different. Quote, "Marx and Engels and their students viewed things quite differently. Marx and Engels saw the class struggle of the proletariat as the means to emancipate the workers from bourgeois leadership, not only in the economy, but also in politics, and to render them capable of pursuing an independent policy guided by an autonomous proletarian party within the framework of a democratic constitution. The first task our teachers found they had to accomplish in order to construct this party of proletarian democracy, was to destroy the illusions of the bourgeois democrats that the mere existence of democracy was sufficient for the liberation of the working class. When the communists today deliver interminable lessons designed to prove the same point, they merely triumphantly announce their discovery of America. They are telling us something we have already known for half a century, except that our conclusion was simply that mere democracy is insufficient, not that democracy is detestable. This insufficiency is clear today wherever the proletariat is not ideologically independent. From this it follows that it is necessary to quicken the ideological maturity of the proletariat, but not to reject democracy." End quote. Kautsky. Demokratie und I don't know, it's weird. The citation says Demokratie und Demokratie. I guess that's democracy and democracy. I don't know. And after the seizure of power, the Bolsheviks found nothing better to do than, quote, "abolish the democracy that had been created after the destruction of Tsarism through universal suffrage, freedom of the press, and freedom of association for all," end quote. The Bolsheviks replaced this with a, quote, "new aristocracy," quote, "of the strangest variety," end quote. Namely a, quote, "proletarian aristocracy," end quote, christened, quote, "proletarian democracy," end quote. Kautsky, Demokratie und Demokratie. The justification the Bolsheviks adduced for this regime of a new aristocracy was the urgent need to consolidate the power of the working class. But Kautsky objected. The classes of the old order, although numerically weak, represented a real social force which no legislative formula could abolish. The only force that could defeat them was a strong and mature working class formed by an advanced economic and social development. In a backward country like Russia, the Bolsheviks were seeking coercive shortcuts and formal guarantees. These, however, would eventually prevent the ideological growth of the proletariat itself, which would be stunted under a system of political and intellectual despotism. Such a system merely corrupted the proletariat into believing that it could, quote, assure the power of socialism through purely mechanical measures, end quote. Kautsky. Wer ist ein Arbeiter? I don't know if that means where is the worker, but I'm just guessing. I have no idea. A genuine dictatorship of the proletariat could only be based on the real strength of the proletariat as a class, democratically verified in society as a whole. Such strength would be evidence that the preconditions existed for the exclusive rule of a united majority class, permitting the real possibility and formal legitimacy of a dictatorship founded on democracy. Quote, if by dictatorship we mean exclusive rule without compromises, then we mean that form of rule of the proletariat which is determined by social conditions in contrast with the capitalist class, which can rule only through compromises with the parties of other classes. Quote, if by dictatorship we mean exclusive rule without compromises, then we mean that form of rule of the proletariat which is determined by social conditions in contrast with the capitalist class, which can rule only through compromises with the parties of other classes, ... Dictatorship in the sense indicated above does not in any way exclude democracy. The democratic republic rather represents the only basis on which a dictatorship of this type can develop and assert itself in conformity with its own goals, end quote. If, on the other hand, a minority dictatorship was established, as in Russia, it would be unable to initiate a new social course, compelled to construct a militarist bureaucratic apparatus to defend its own political monopoly, and unable to muster the social forces needed to transform the relations of production. It would have to reconcile itself to ever-increasing compromises with the capitalist mode of production and capitalists themselves. Footnote. See Kautsky's Klasse in Diktatur und Partei-Diktatur. I guess that's class dictatorship and party dictatorship, published in Der Kampf 14. End footnote. When Kautsky reads Rosa Luxemburg's work, Die Russische Revolution, published by Paul Levy, Kautsky saw Luxemburg's criticisms of the Bolsheviks on the issue of democracy as substantially similar to his own. Luxemburg, Kautsky wrote, quote, most decisively and thoroughly condemns the suffocation of democracy and democracy's replacement by terrorism. What Rosa Luxemburg says in this regard, especially about the degradation of the proletariat, which results from this policy, is among the most significant and penetrating of all that has been written about Bolshevism. No one who has concerned himself with Bolshevism, whether for it or against it, can ignore Luxemburg's arguments. Luxemburg's arguments constitute the most important part of the work in question, end quote. Kautsky. At the same time, Kautsky maintained that the charge Luxemburg had leveled against him in her writings, namely that he understood democracy in, quote, bourgeois terms, was without foundation. Kautsky said that when she declared that, quote, dictatorship consists in the way in which democracy is used, not in democracy's abolition, end quote, Kautsky was in full agreement. I'm going to repeat that because it was italics. Kautsky said that when Luxemburg declared that, quote, dictatorship consists in the way in which democracy is used and not in democracy's abolition, end quote, he was in full agreement. Where Luxemburg and Kautsky's positions really diverged, Kautsky said, was in their specific assessment of the relationship between democracy and democracy's social content in the Russian Revolution. Rosa Luxemburg had rebuked the Bolsheviks for not having made democracy the form of a bold socialist policy, while Kautsky thought that democracy in Russia would necessarily have to respect precisely the impossibility of any such policy, any such socialist policy, whose preconditions were entirely lacking. Footnote: Rosa Luxemburg und der Bolschewismus. According to Kautsky, Luxemburg was caught in an insuperable contradiction, since Luxemburg separated politics from economics. While Luxemburg reproached the Bolsheviks with not having pursued a sufficiently audacious policy, Kautsky thought that in this respect the Bolsheviks were merely reflecting a historical necessity. Kautsky's charge against the Bolsheviks, on the contrary, was of having suppressed the constitutional form of the democratic republic, which alone would have permitted a normal and adequate expression of Russian social limitations and afforded the proletariat conditions in which to advance the proletariat's own class organization and to shift those limits back on the back as the economy progressed and the society matured. In fact, although Kautsky was correct to note a point of agreement with Luxemburg in their denunciation of the bureaucratic party dictatorship of the Bolsheviks, Kautsky made no mention of the fact that the Polish revolutionary fought for a political order which was not parliamentary, but Soviet, and which therefore presupposed the breakup of the liberal bourgeois state machine, in claiming that, quote, what really counts in the analysis of Rosa Luxemburg is only her impassioned and trenchant defense of democracy, end quote. Kautsky was ignoring the importance of the disagreements between himself and Rosa Luxemburg, whose positions he exploited for his own purposes. Analyzing the origins of the Bolshevik conception of dictatorship as coercion, Kautsky asserted that the task of social democracy during the war had been to struggle to restore the possibility of contest between parties. The Bolshevik conception, he continued, was a product of the moral and intellectual degradation caused by the war. Quote, the World War led to the moral and intellectual debasement of the toiling classes, not only because the World War brutalized nearly all strata of the population and elevated the least developed section of the proletariat to the vanguard of the social movement, but above all because it aggravated the proletariat's misery enormously, and thus replaced calm deliberation with the most bitter exasperation. End quote. Kautsky. Furthermore, the war induced a section of the working class to withdraw to the conviction typical of the upper classes that, quote, force alone constitutes the decisive factor in history, and that one can obtain anything one wants provided one commands the necessary force and is prepared to act without scruples, end quote. Kautsky, Terrorism and Communism. Which, hopefully, if my computer cooperates, will be on the channel soon. Polemical zeal led Kautsky to forget the fact that in 1917 he himself had defined the Russian proletariat as a boldly revolutionary class. Trotsky rejoined that Kautsky's analysis ignored the fact that it was precisely the war which had taught the proletariat a new mentality. For the lesson the worker had learned from the, quote, imperialist war was that, quote, the old criteria were completely useless, end quote. The parliamentary democracy of the Kautskys had thus lagged behind the new mentality of the revolutionary working class. Footnote: Trotsky, Terrorism and Communism. Kautsky in turn replied that Trotsky saw the effects of the war from the deformed vantage point of the conditions that prevailed in the defeated countries at the end of the war, and that even so he saw only the short-term and not the long-term effects. That section of the proletariat, which had opted for violence as the road to power, while it could take initial advantage of the consequences of the defeat of the bourgeois state in the war, would be unable, if it did not assume power, to pursue the work of reconstruction, which demanded both workers' unity and democracy. The proletariat would thus eventually have to cede power, as in Russia, to the professionals of organized violence. Footnote: Von der Demokratie zur Staatssklaverei. Eine Auseinandersetzung mit Trotsky. End footnote. The deeper origin of both the violence of the Bolsheviks and their lack of success in realizing socialist goals lay in the fact that their unbridled subjectivism had violated the limits of immature historical conditions, condemning their program to the impracticable. The Bolsheviks had then reacted by compounding their initial error and elevating violence to a permanent method of government, reducing their original Soviet principles to a, quote, fig leaf. But the Bolsheviks, Kautsky said, were not content to apply violence in Russian conditions. Perhaps their worst sin was to claim that the, quote, Russian case, in reality so exceptional, should be made the rule, that the Bolshevik path to power should become mandatory for all true socialists. In Russia, quote, from the autumn of 1917, there arose out of the revolution a dictatorship more centralized, extensive, and unlimited than has ever been seen before. Such a dictatorship is now apparently to be considered not an exceptional case, owing to its origin to an exceptional situation, but the form that every revolutionary regime must assume. End quote. End quote. Kautsky, And that's from Von der Demokratie zur Staatssklaverei, eine Auseinandersetzung mit Trotsky. I'm assuming that means from democracy to state slavery, a response towards Trotsky, or maybe, I think mit means with. Let's see. Eine, let's see what the an exchange with Trotsky. Okay, so that's what ein Auseinandersetzung mit Trotsky means. Section 3. The model of the Commune and the Soviet state. In State and Revolution, and later in The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, Lenin had counterposed Soviet proletarian democracy, founded on the principles of the Commune, forcefully expounded by Marx, to bourgeois democracy, founded on parliamentarism and the division of powers. Initially, then, the standard of the Commune state became the banner the Bolsheviks upheld against the opportunists and, quote, Kautskyists. In his writings against Bolshevism, Kautsky dealt with the Commune more than once. Kautsky sought to demonstrate that the Commune had in reality represented a form of dictatorship which, since it was based on universal suffrage and a multi-party system, was completely different from the dictatorship of the Bolsheviks, which was founded on restricted and indirect suffrage and on the ever more absolute power of a single party. In the past, Kautsky had taken an ambiguous attitude toward the Marx's famous address on the Commune. As all his analyses of the state openly demonstrated, he did not agree that the bourgeois state had to be, quote, smashed, as Marx demanded, or that the parliamentary system had to be abolished for a fusion of legislative and executive powers, or that the bureaucracy had to be dismantled as a professionally organized apparatus. But Kautsky had never dealt openly with the contrast between his own positions and those of Marx, passing in silence over the incompatibility of the two directions of thought, that of Marx and Kautsky's. In effect, from the end of the 19th century, when Engels was still alive, to the First World War, Kautsky had engaged in a sort of revisionism on the question of the state that never received a systematic theoretical expression. In the course of the post-war crisis, Kautsky utilized Marxist theses on the Commune partially and functionally to serve his own purposes. The Bolsheviks did the same, although for opposite ends. What had to be, quote, smashed, Kautsky said, was not the parliamentary state, but the remnants of the absolutist state, in order to attain the full parliamentarism of the democratic republic. When the Bolsheviks cited the Commune as justification for the structure of the Soviet state, Kautsky polemically emphasized the democratic pluralistic aspects of the dictatorship of the Commune. Later, Kautsky denounced what he called Marx's outmoded theses on the abolition of parliamentarism and the division of powers. In marshalling evidence for his case, Kautsky made use of the crisis of Sovietism. Historical reality had demonstrated to the Bolsheviks themselves, Kautsky argued, that the commune state could not function. This very impossibility had led to an ultra-centralized dictatorship, in complete contradiction with the commune. Ultra-democratism, he said, an abstraction that was never and could never have been a reality, had paved the way for absolute despotism. The illusion that any impediment to complete popular control of the state could be abolished had led in reality to the abolition of any means of control over it. Kautsky asserted that although Marx had written in 1875 that there was a transitional epoch, quote, between capitalist and communist society, end quote, which, quote, can be nothing other than the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. This statement had to be compared to what he had said about the content of such a dictatorship in 1871. At that time, describing the political regime of the commune, Kautsky had spoken of a, quote, government of the working class, end quote. Sorry. I don't know who he is. At the time, describing the political regime of the commune, he had spoken of a, quote, government of the working class, end quote, founded on, quote, universal suffrage, end quote, and therefore on the plurality of organizations which is necessarily implied by universal suffrage. In this sense, the dictatorship of the commune was a dictatorship representing a proletarian majority and founded on democracy. When he discussed it, Marx spoke, quote, not of a form of government, but a state of fact, end quote, Kautsky. In 1891, Engels, explaining the connection between democracy and the dictatorship of the proletariat, effectively ruled out, in the spirit of Marx, any confusion between the dictatorship of the proletariat and the dictatorship of a party. Quote, the democratic republic is the specific form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. In sum, it was unthinkable for Marx that the dictatorship of the proletariat, which he said must rest on, quote, universal suffrage exercised by the entire people, end quote, should take the Bolshevik form of a regime founded on the, quote, right to vote of a particular and privileged class, end quote. Kautsky, democracy or dictatorship. The Bolshevik type of dictatorship would inevitably fail to establish any form of democracy, Soviet or otherwise. Without democracy for all, Kautsky argued, the regime would be compelled in practice to elevate repression into a general principle, leaving the ruling group as the sole arbiter of society. But this would destroy democracy even in the ruling party, and even more so in the mere echo chambers of power, which the Soviets were condemned to become. Quote, all governments, Kautsky wrote, quote, including revolutionary governments, believe that the opposition is abusing its rights. ... Scarcely had the Bolsheviks dissolved the opposition of the Mensheviks and the center and right social revolutionaries in the Soviets when a great struggle broke out between the Bolsheviks and the left social revolutionaries with whom the government had been formed. Most of the left social revolutionaries were then also ousted from the Soviets. Thus, the circle of those elements of the proletariat who enjoy political rights and on whom the Bolshevik regime is founded is growing ever narrower. End quote. Kautsky. Dictatorship of the proletariat. But a party that dispensed with popular consent could base its dictatorship only on loyal military forces. To remain in power, it must reduce all social forces to a state of, quote, complete apathy or complete discouragement, end quote, or else prepare to suppress an active opposition left with no alternative but revolt or guerrilla fighting. Such a dictatorship, quote, perpetually reproduces civil war and is in continual danger of overthrow, end quote. Kautsky. Dictatorship of the proletariat. Incapable of allowing space for any position that is not an immediate and instrumental expression of its own power, the Bolshevik regime sought to cancel a dialectical principle of all social, political, and intellectual life, the revolutionary rule that the, quote, new always begins as a minority. A political system that rested on the dictatorship of an armed and privileged minority had nothing positive to offer innovating minorities. On the contrary, it feared the emergence and presence of such minorities. Political democracy, by contrast, was the only system capable of regulating this decisive problem of social life. Quote, it is clear, Kautsky wrote, quote, how important the defense of minorities was for the initiators of the socialist parties, who everywhere began as small minorities, and for the political development of the proletariat itself. The protection of minorities is of great importance in the ranks of the working class. Any new doctrine, be that doctrine theoretical or tactical, is always represented by a minority at the outset. ... The defense of minorities is an indispensable condition of democratic development, no less important than the rule of the majority. End quote. Kautsky. The fact that the ideas advocated by minorities were not always new or positive was no reason to throw out the baby with the bathwater. This, then, was the fundamental difference between the experience of the Commune and that of the USSR, which rendered the Bolsheviks' appeal to 1871 purely instrumental. Indeed, Kautsky wrote, quote, the Paris Commune was superior to the Republic of the Soviets in one essential respect. The Paris Commune was the work of the entire proletariat. All the tendencies of socialism participated in the Paris Commune, and none stood apart or was excluded from the Paris Commune. The Socialist Party that governs in Russia today, on the contrary, came to power by struggling against all the other socialist parties and exercises its rule through the exclusion of the other socialist parties. End quote. Dictatorship of the Kautsky, dictatorship of the proletariat. In the Commune, it was never contested that, quote, supreme power lay in the hands of those elected by universal suffrage, end quote. Kautsky. Terrorism and communism. Indeed, the Commune was so democratic that some people saw the Commune as a, quote, capitulation to anarchism, end quote. Kautsky. With what legitimacy then could the Bolsheviks point to the Commune as the model of their own regime? In 1921, pursuing his polemic with Trotsky, Kautsky wrote, quote, how can the Bolsheviks today claim allegiance to the Paris Commune and the Marx of 1871? For the Bolsheviks, he said, end quote. For the Bolsheviks, Kautsky said, reference to the Commune had a purely tactical function, signifying the need to destroy the old state apparatus. It had no strategic value as a model for the reconstruction of a new state apparatus. Anarchistic in their first phase, in their second phase, the communists became loyal heirs of, quote, Russianism, the illegitimate scions of the czarist despotism against which they had revolted. Quote, the Commune and Marx demanded the abolition of the old army and the old army's replacement by a militia. The Soviet government began with the dissolution of the old army, but later created the Red Army, one of the strongest military forces in Europe. The Commune and Marx demanded the dissolution of the state police. The Soviet Republic merely dissolved the old police in order to construct the new apparatus of the Cheka, a political police commanding broader, less limited, and harsher powers than those of French Bonapartism or Russian Tsarism. The Commune and Marx demanded the replacement of the state bureaucracy with functionaries elected by the people through universal suffrage. The Soviet Republic has destroyed the old Tsarist bureaucracy, but in its place has erected a new, equally centralized bureaucracy with even more extensive powers than its predecessor, since it now regulates all economic life and therefore controls not only the liberty, but even the subsistence of the population. End quote. Kautsky. In only one respect had the Bolsheviks remained faithful to the Commune, in their unification of legislative and executive powers, which they treated as a potent instrument of their dictatorship, but one that differed from the Commune even in this regard, since the Commune's unified powers rested on popular representation elected by universal suffrage. In conclusion, Kautsky argued, the Bolsheviks, after utilizing the example of the Commune during an initial phase in order to destroy the old state apparatus and supersede parliamentarism, had totally abandoned it in a second phase, drawing closer in the construction of their own state to the Bonapartist model and to bureaucratic rule. After yielding opportunistically to the radicalism of the backward masses, since this radicalism served to dissolve the old order, they then confronted tasks which these backward masses were unable to resolve in a process of reconstruction. They thereupon fettered the freedom of movement of these masses and suppressed any form of democracy, delegating the solution of tasks delegating the solution of tasks that the revolutionary forces were unable in their immaturity to broach to a super-centralized apparatus far from the norms of any sort of socialism. What then was the nature of the new regime? What were the reasons for the regime's survival, despite all the difficulties the regime encountered? In Terrorism and Communism, Kautsky formulated a definition he was never to abandon. Politically, the Bolshevik regime was a bureaucratic dictatorship. Economically, the Bolshevik regime was a state capitalist order. The reason for the persistence of the Bolsheviks as rulers was precisely that the Bolsheviks survived not as socialists but as architects of a bourgeois regime, thereby re-entering the limits of possible economic and social development in Russia, but in such a, quote, abnormal and mystified political form as to present a negative pole of comparison to the norms either of a bourgeois regime or of socialism. Quote, many Western revolutionaries, end quote, Kautsky complained, quote, triumphantly vaunt the fact that Bolshevism has remained in power so long and remains unshakable even today, at least outwardly, whereas its detractors had predicted from the very outset of its rule a rapid collapse. The fact is that this collapse would have come to pass long ago had the Bolsheviks remained faithful to their program. They have maintained themselves in power only because they have taken one backward step after another, such that they have now arrived at the opposite of what they had attempted to achieve. They began by throwing democratic principles overboard in order to seize power. Then, to maintain this power, they jettisoned socialist principles. In other words, they have succeeded as individuals, but they have sacrificed their principles, demonstrating that they are outright opportunists. Up to now, Bolshevism has succeeded in triumphing in Russia because socialism has suffered a complete defeat. End quote. Kautsky, Terrorism and Communism. From the economic standpoint, Kautsky argued the most the Bolsheviks could achieve was a new type of capitalism, which differed from the old in the preponderant role of the state and in the nature of its administrative stratum, which is not a class of employers but a new bureaucracy. Thus, in 1919, Kautsky laid the basis for an interpretation of the bureaucratic regime as the rule of a, quote, new class, end quote, a theory that was later to be so often reinterpreted in different variations in the course of polemics about the nature of the Soviet state. Kautsky claimed that because of economic ruin and the absence of democracy, what was emerging in Russia was, quote, a new class of functionaries that is increasingly appropriating all real power to itself and rendering the liberties of the toilers illusory, ... The absolute power of the workers' councils has been transformed into the much more absolute power of a new bureaucracy, partially issued of the councils themselves, partially appointed by them, and finally partially imposed on them. This bureaucracy represents the third and highest of the three classes. The new ruling class constituted under the patronage of old idealist and communist militants, end quote. Concurrently, a, quote, new capitalism was taking shape, quote, far inferior to the industrial capitalism of the past, end quote. This capitalism, quote, new, in the sense that it replaced private power with the economic power of the state, without leading to any real socialization, in the absence of a genuine mechanism of democratic management, furnished the basis of the most colossal political and social servitude that had ever been seen, even in Russia itself. Quote, industrial capitalism has ceased to be private and has become state capitalism. At first, the two bureaucracies, public and private, stood opposed to each other in critical, even hostile manner. The worker had some possibility of forcing at times one, at times the other, to back down. But now the state bureaucracy and the bureaucracy of capital form a single whole. This is the final result of the great socialist transformation wrought by Bolshevism. It is the most oppressive despotism Russia has ever known. The replacement of democracy by the arbitrary power of the workers' councils, which were supposed to expropriate the expropriators, has now led to the arbitrary domination of a new bureaucracy and has reduced democracy to a dead letter, end quote. Kautsky, Terrorism and Communism. In his book, Von Demokratie zur Staatssklaverei, published in 1921, Kautsky maintained that the character of Bolshevism was now plainly reactionary. Politically, Kautsky said, Bolshevik, quote, state capitalism, established after the failure of the first chaotic experiments, was merely a continuation of the tendency of Russian capitalism itself. This state capitalism, quote, represents nothing new, since capitalism in Russia had always existed only by virtue of state power, end quote. Kautsky, From Democracy to, what's it? I think it's Von Demokratie zur Staatssklaverei. Something comes along, yeah, let's whip it. When something comes along, let's whip it. Sorry, that song's stuck in my head. Sorry, I was looking for a translation of that, but I think that means from democracy to state slavery. Having fused with the past on the terrain of state bureaucratic capitalism, and having adopted czarist methods of political despotism, Bolshevism was inevitably destined to become a reactionary rampart against the struggles of the proletariat, subject to Bolshevism's domination. To defend itself, Kautsky prophesied, the bureaucracy would not hesitate to forge alliances with capitalists, quote, if Bolshevism, end quote. The conclusion of his book declared, quote, last long enough without backing down, then we could yet witness the spectacle of Bolshevism marching side by side with the capitalists of the West against the Russian proletariat in its struggle for liberty. Then its evolution would be complete, end quote. Kautsky. from democracy to state slavery. Kautsky summed up his controversy with the Bolsheviks over the state and the significance of democracy in a work titled Die proletarische Revolution in ihr Programm und ihr Programm. Die proletarische Revolution und ihr Programm. The proletarian revolution and its program is what I'm assuming that means, which took the form of a commentary on the program of the SPD. On the program the SPD had adopted at its Congress in Görlitz in 1921. In the proletarian revolution and its program, he maintained that one of the roots of the failure of the Bolsheviks, who advocated an extreme democracy in principle and an equally extreme despotism in practice, lay in Lenin's simplistic conception of the state. Lenin had started by unrealistically imagining that the state was a very simple matter. That it was a very simple matter to make a state function. It required, Lenin thought, no more than the transfer of power to the masses. Later, assuming power and registering the collapse of his own illusions, Lenin fell back on a practice that was opposite to his theory. In reality, Lenin and the Bolsheviks have rejected the democratic republic as a framework of power for the proletariat, partly because they had not understood that only the democratic republic could allow the state apparatus to be functionally remodeled. Kautsky argued that when Marx spoke of the need to, quote, smash the state machine, end quote, parenthesis, and here Kautsky adapted Marx to his own conceptions, end parenthesis, Marx, quote, did not at all mean to say that the proletariat was in no case able to exercise its own rule without destroying the apparatus of the existing state. Marx rejected only a particular form of this apparatus, the bureaucratic militarist form, which had attained the bureaucratic militarist form's extreme expression under the Second Empire in France, end quote. Kautsky, the proletarian revolution and its program. Today, according to Kautsky, there were two great states in Europe in which it was necessary to, quote, smash the state machine for proletarian purposes, namely, quote, France, that empire without an emperor, and to an even greater extent, Russia, that Tsarism without a Tsar. It is clear from the words of Marx that the destruction of the present state machine in Russia constitutes the indispensable precondition for any progress of the proletariat, end quote. On the other hand, in countries in which a democratic republic existed, the problem was not to smash the state machine, but to conquer the state machine and set the state machine to work for the purposes of the proletariat, reforming and correcting the state machine. Quote, the working class, wrote Kautsky, quote, cannot simply take possession of any state machine and use that state machine for the working class's own purposes. A bureaucratic militarist state machine is useless for this. Only a democratic republic can be used for this purpose. Where the victorious proletariat does not possess such a republic, the victorious proletariat must create a democratic republic, end quote. Kautsky. Proletarian revolution and its program. This, then, was the great error of the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks had jettisoned the democratic republic. After denying that the Bolsheviks had any right to claim allegiance to any sort of democracy whatever, since the Bolsheviks had suppressed all democracy, Kautsky for the first time expressly settled accounts with the attitude Marx had taken toward the elimination of the bureaucratic state apparatus in his address on the Paris Commune. In State and Revolution, Lenin had accused Kautsky of a, quote, superstitious belief, end quote, in bureaucracy, of not having, quote, understood at all the difference between bourgeois parliamentarism, which combines democracy, parenthesis, not for the people, end parenthesis, with bureaucracy, parenthesis, against the people, end parenthesis, and proletarian democracy, which will take immediate steps to cut bureaucracy down to the bureaucracy's roots, and which will be able to carry these measures through to the end, to the complete abolition of bureaucracy, to the introduction of complete democracy for the people, end quote. Kautsky, after observing that no state stood as far from, quote, proletarian democracy, end quote, as that erected by Lenin, acknowledged that it was, quote, true, that he had, quote, ignored these challenges up to now, end quote. Quote, not, however, out of superstition towards the bureaucracy, but because I never attached great purpose to me. Let me repeat that. Kautsky, after observing that no state stood as far from, quote, proletarian democracy, end quote, as that erected by Lenin, acknowledged that it was, quote, true, that he had, quote, ignored these challenges up to now, end quote. Quote, not, however, out of superstition towards the bureaucracy, but because I never attached great importance to them, end quote. Kautsky, the Proletarian Revolution and its program. In reality, there was nothing surprising about Kautsky's admission, given Kautsky's past analyses of the state and of the significance of its bureaucratic apparatus. Goaded by Lenin's polemic, however, Kautsky now explicitly, quote, revised Marx's position on those questions. While claiming that in his writing on the Commune, Marx had not devoted more than a, quote, couple of sentences, end quote, to the elimination of the bureaucracy, Kautsky did not content himself with merely limiting the import of Marx's affirmations. Kautsky subjected them to a direct critique, emboldened by the fact that not even the Bolsheviks, the most ardent supporters of an anti-bureaucratic state model, had been able to follow the dictates of this model. Indeed, nobody had violated them so thoroughly as they. Were Marx's measures realistic, compatible with historical social exigencies? Discussing the principle that state functionaries would receive the same wages as workers, Kautsky remarked that of course the proletariat could not leave excessive wage privileges intact, but that, quote, consequent to the experience we have had since then, bracket, i.e. since the Paris Commune, in bracket, particularly in Russia, it must certainly be doubted whether it will be possible during the period of transition to socialism to attract all the state officials of the necessary intellectual caliber that are needed if they are offered only a worker's wage, end quote. As for the demand that deputies be revocable at will, Kautsky asserted that this demand arose, quote, in an epoch in which the voters still confronted elected officials as a disorganized mass, end quote. Quote, in the epoch of the Paris Commune, this was still the prevalent situation. Once elected, a deputy could do as he pleased. His electors lost any control over him. Hence there emerged the idea that the electors should be able to recall a deputy who had disappointed them, end quote. Kautsky maintained that it was useless merely to repeat formulae as Lenin did, without situating them in the historic context in which they had arisen. The development of modern political parties had put an end to the disorganization of voters. Since their rise, exemplified by social democracy, quote, the responsibility of the deputy to his electors, has increasingly lost ground to his responsibility to his party. End quote. The deputy was ever more representative of a party, ever less of disorganized voters. Quote, the individual deputy can no longer do as the individual deputy pleases in Parliament. The individual deputy is subject to the discipline of the parliamentary caucus of the individual's party, is constantly controlled by his party, end quote. Under present conditions, which no longer corresponded to those of the epoch of the First International and the Paris Commune, when this demand was, quote, wholly suitable, the demand for the right of revocability of deputies by single groups of electors would represent a serious step backwards, for if it was implemented, here was an echo of Kautsky's theses of 1893, it would subject the deputies to local and sectoral pressures, quote, What was reasonable and revolutionary 50 years ago is now not only wholly unreasonable, but has even become reactionary. The deputy who today prefers dependence on a mass of voters lacking any mutual links to dependence on a party whose unity is based on an idea is acting in a reactionary manner. End quote. Kautsky, The Proletarian Revolution and Its Program. Another of Lenin's battle cries was Marx's emphasis on the need to unify legislative and executive powers. Once again invoking the criterion of historical specificity, Kautsky maintained that the model Marx probably had in mind was that of the Jacobins, which had been valid for the internal and external conditions under which the Jacobins had to operate. This model, however, had no relevance to a general theory of the state, of the normal functioning of institutions. On the contrary, there were two fundamental arguments in favor of the division of powers so far as socialists were concerned. The first was that socialism could be built only in a context of internal and external peace. Here Kautsky reiterated his positions on the transitional period, which were in complete contradiction with the Leninist view that the dictatorship of the proletariat must necessarily be based on force. Kautsky did not exclude that, quote, under certain social conditions, war or even civil war could be wholly appropriate, even necessary for the conquest of political power, end quote. Namely, when reaction created such conditions through its own violence, end parenthesis. He did, however, deny that socialism could be built otherwise than in conditions of normal social peace, in which the democratic method regulated the exercise of power. Quote, for the period of transition from capitalism to socialism, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, we need peace most urgently, not only peace abroad but also at home, not in the sense of a reconciliation of classes, but rather in the sense of a conduct of class struggle through the methods of democracy and not through the violence of arms. In these conditions, there is, in truth, not the slightest reason to unify executive and legislative powers. On the contrary, a multitude of reasons speak against such a measure. End quote. Kautsky. The division of powers, Kautsky maintained, was above all a progressive expression of the division of labor in the institutional domain. It was not, quote, an arbitrary phenomenon, end quote, but it was also a democratic necessity. For, quote, history shows us that an assembly that commands both executive and legislative power does not brook the slightest opposition, end quote. Kautsky, Proletarian Revolution and Its Program. Finally, the division of powers is more functional for the accomplishment of the specific goals of both the executive and legislative powers. It corresponded to the innermost structure of the executive power, whose task was action and whose condition was maximum internal unity, which active opposition indeed tended to paralyze. On the other hand, the legislative power absolutely demanded that every law be born of a confrontation of conflicting opinions. It is therefore constituted the proper institutional locus of political divisions. To subordinate the latter to the former, or actually to unify them, would necessarily be to annul the autonomy of the legislative power. In other words, to confer on the executive the de facto ability to establish laws. Thus, the great doctrinaire, the custodian of Marxist orthodoxy, did not hesitate openly to criticize some of the central aspects of the thought of Marx, accusing Lenin of an inability to evaluate Marxism critically in the light of the lessons of history and social change. But if Lenin was such a faithful disciple of Marx, Kautsky went on, if Lenin was so wedded to the unification of legislative and executive powers in the name of Marxist precepts, why then did Lenin refused to go all the way? Why did he ignore another central aspect of the thought of Marx, namely that the unification of powers is not intended to permit a party dictatorship, but to rest on universal suffrage? Quote, of all the institutions of the Paris Commune emphasized by Marx, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, there is only one to which the Bolsheviks remain faithful today, the unification of the executive and legislative powers into a single entity. But the Bolsheviks have not unified these powers into a representative body elected through universal suffrage like the Paris Commune, end quote. The Bolsheviks, divesting the unification of powers of its basis in universal suffrage, had transformed it into an instrument of their own dictatorship, betraying Marxism even while proclaiming themselves its most assiduous votaries. What was the ultimate inevitable result of such an attitude? A unified power without controls could never halt at the establishment of the dictatorship of a party, but must end in the dictatorship of the party leaders. Such a dictatorship, however, represented a major obstacle to social development and to the maturity of the masses, which formed the sole guarantee of socialism. By 1919, Kautsky had reached a drastic conclusion that the Bolshevik regime, founded on a dictatorship of party leaders, was politically and economically more oppressive for the working class than capitalism itself. Given this premise, it was logical that henceforth Kautsky's sole aim was the overthrow of a regime which called itself revolutionary, but was counter-revolutionary in practice. In August 1921, issuing his book, From Democracy to State Slavery, Kautsky declared, quote, "To lift Russia out of the mire into which it now threatens to sink is the most pressing task of the moment, above all, for all socialists, since it is in their hands that the destiny of the Russian people lies," end quote. Kautsky. New section. Section 4. The inevitable failure of the Third International. Quote, "What is the world revolution?" End quote. Kautsky asked in Terrorism and Communism. Kautsky replied, quote, "It can be conceived in two different ways, either as the development of the socialist idea in the world, accompanied by the strengthening of the proletariat and a simultaneous sharpening of the class struggle, until socialism becomes a motor force of world significance, increasingly determining the fate of all the states. Or it can be understood as a revolutionization of the world in the Bolshevik sense, the conquest of political power by the proletariat in all the great states in the very near future. Otherwise, this world revolution would be unable to save the Russian Revolution. The complete introduction of Soviet republics, dictatorships of the communist parties, and thus the unleashing of civil wars throughout the globe for our generation. End quote. Kautsky, Terrorism and Communism. Kautsky consistently maintained that the preconditions for the success of the Bolshevik Revolution were lacking in the West. In the West, the success of the working class depended on the working class's unity. If it was divided, it could neither take nor keep power. Moreover, in the Western countries, precisely those most important for the world revolution, the strength of the ruling classes remained intact. They had emerged victorious from the World War and possessed armies far more stable than that of Tsarist Russia, whose disintegration had cleared the field for the revolutionaries. The project of civil war was therefore doomed to failure on the very terrain on which it was supposed to operate, that of violence. To have any possibility of success, international Bolshevism would have to exploit in the Western masses the same contempt for the democratic methods characteristic of those who had never known or experienced it. But in the West, Kautsky asserted, quote, "Democracy did not emerge yesterday, as in Russia. Democracy has been won through a series of revolutions and centuries-long struggles. It has become the very flesh and blood of the masses," end quote. Kautsky. Indeed, it was the masses themselves who sought to teach the superior classes the rules of democracy. One second, sorry. All right, cool. Finally, in the West, it would not be possible for the victorious proletariat to reproduce the conditions on which the Bolshevik dictatorship was based. Quote, here it is quite impossible for the entire classes, among them the largest, to be deprived of political rights. End quote. Kautsky, Terrorism and Communism. In the West, the very consequences of socioeconomic advance made it impossible to imitate the shortcuts. God damn it. Sorry, my computer's being a douche. Imitate the shortcuts which the revolution had taken in Russia and which had perverted it. Quote, socialism cannot conquer power unless it is strong enough to maintain its own superiority over the other parties within the limits of democracy. This is why socialism has not the slightest reason to repudiate democracy. This is why socialism has not the slightest reason, and it will be precisely the most advanced section of the proletariat that will certainly not agree to the replacement of democracy by dictatorship, which in practice always eventually becomes a personal dictatorship. End quote. Kautsky. Terrorism and Communism. The inherently mechanistic perspective of those who insisted on the universal validity of Bolshevism, Kautsky argued, were obvious from their attempt to transform the institutional forms of the Russian Revolution into models to be imitated without taking account of the relationship of class forces and the characteristics under which the Russian form arose. Anyone considering the developed West, Kautsky said, must first of all note that because of economic development, the relations between workers and peasants were radically different from those in the USSR, as were the relations between the masses and the bourgeoisie. What, then, would it mean to generalize the model of the Russian Revolution and to attempt to oppose its institutions? The Communist International, Kautsky wrote, was, quote, an international of action, end quote. But the action on which it was based was too simplistic. Quote, there can be no more fatal illusion than the dream of such an international. It is quite true that labor is struggling against capital in all countries. It is likewise true that its goal everywhere is the conquest of state power and the development of production in a socialist direction. But in practice, these objectives are transformed into a series of concrete particular tasks which differ in the different countries. One thing in the countries that were victorious in the World War, another in the countries that were defeated, one thing in the countries in which the peasants still have revolutionary aspirations, another in the countries in which the peasantry hold conservative positions. One thing where capitalist industry predominates, another where it constitutes a minority sector. One thing in countries in which militarism is strong, another in those in which it is weak. One thing in countries in which the popular masses have been educated in democracy for decades or even centuries, another in those in which these masses are only now beginning to look beyond the limits of the isolated village, etc. Yet they want to create an organization which, despite all these incredible differences, provokes and guides simultaneous mass actions of the same type, end quote. Exclamation point, end quote. That's from a piece called Vergangenheit und Zukunft der Internationale. Karl Kautsky. The attempt to adapt to the West the dictatorship of workers' and peasants' councils that arose from Russian conditions, Kautsky argued, was one of the aspects of the artificial universalism of Bolshevism. In Russia, the minority and the workers faced a weak bourgeoisie and a mass of peasants, whom the workers were able to lead because they were revolutionary in the democratic sense, as a consequence of the survivals of feudalism. But none of these conditions existed in the developed capitalist countries. Quote, in the modern capitalist countries where the peasants are conservative but also already educated and organized politically, it becomes wholly illusory to view peasant councils within a general council system as a factor acting in a more revolutionary sense towards socialism rather than democracy. A dictatorship of councils is condemned to the most complete failure. End quote. Kautsky. Commenting on the foundation of the Third International, Kautsky claimed that an organization that was incapable of evaluating national and socioeconomic specificities, issuing external controls to parties that were supposed to provoke the revolution in other countries, could never have any real validity. In reality, the Communist International was an international in name only. The Communist International suffered from an inherent and destructive contradiction. For the Communist International conferred the leadership of revolutionary processes not on those who were supposed to realize them, but on those who had already done so. It thus turned those who had to work actively into passive instruments of others who guided their action from outside. In any case, the representatives of the developed countries to which the revolution was to be extended were, quote, as a rule, mere figureheads in the executive committee of the Third International, end quote. Kautsky. Regardless of its intentions, Kautsky said, the Third International acted in practice as a, quote, instrument of the government of one particular country in which the executive committee resides, end quote. Kautsky. This is evident from the very fact that the communists of the West were organizationally incapable of standing on their own 2 feet, but received direct subsidies from the Russian government, facilitating attacks against them and inciting damaging suspicions, end quote. Kautsky. Dependent on Moscow for their existence, Kautsky wrote in 1925, the communist parties of the West assumed the role of outright, quote, desperados, end quote, in the service of their patrons, launching a systematic and deliberate attack on the, quote, proletarian parties outside Russia which do not depend, end quote, on the Bolsheviks, which is a permanent objective in a struggle waged by all available methods, including, quote, lies and, quote, deceit. Indeed, quote, for years now, the Soviet government has occupied itself primarily with an enterprise designed to enslave, corrupt, debilitate, and stupefy the proletariat inside and outside Russia, rendering it increasingly incapable of liberating itself, end quote. Kautsky eventually came to condemn the Soviet system as even worse than the regimes of Mussolini and Horthy. Parenthesis, he was writing in 1925 when the opposition parties and press had not been formally suppressed in Italy, end parenthesis. It's kind of reminiscent of what Kautsky's going to say about the Stalin period. I mean, Trotsky's going to say about the Stalin period. Obviously, Trotsky was writing before 1940 when he was assassinated, so 1941 hadn't occurred yet, which I think is the year, which I know is the year that the Holocaust really starts up, but it's also, I think, when Barbarossa happens, 1941. Might be 1940. I think it's 1941, though. Kautsky eventually came to condemn the Soviet system as even worse than the regimes of Mussolini and Horthy, who is, Hungary, I think. Horthy, right? Parenthesis, Kautsky was writing in 1825 when the opposition parties and press had not been formally suppressed in Italy, end parenthesis. Quote, the Soviet government, end quote. Kautsky went so far as to write, quote, now represents the gravest obstacle to its, bracket, the proletariat's, end bracket, rise in the world. It is even worse than the infamous Horthy regime in Hungary or the Mussolini regime in Italy, which did not yet make any effort at opposition by the proletariat as radically impossible as the Soviet regime does, end quote. Hence Kautsky's categorical conclusion, quote, this regime today is no longer simply an enemy of all non-Bolshevik parties. It has become the most dangerous enemy of the proletariat itself, end quote. Kautsky. The combination of social democrat charges like this with the communist accusations that the Social Democrats were the principal obstacle to the revolution, and therefore the mainstay of bourgeois reaction, was a measure of the profound cleavage that now divided the Western workers' movement. A concrete occasion for Kautsky to denounce Soviet, quote, Bonapartism and its congenital inclination to resolve political questions by violence came in February 1921, when the Bolsheviks decided to terminate manu militari, the existence of the Menshevik Republic in Georgia. In September 1920, Vanderfelte, MacDonald, and Kautsky himself had visited Georgia, and Kautsky later published a pamphlet, Georgien, eine sozialdemokratische Bauernrepublik, the final chapter of which were appropriately modified after the end of Menshevism in this region. Kautsky argued that the suppression of the Georgian Republic showed that the internal despotism of the Russian Revolution was also beginning to generate a militaristic imperialism destined to culminate in Caesarism. Kautsky wrote, quote, Soviet Russia has entered a new phase of Soviet Russia's revolution, one which corresponds to the third phase of the French Revolution, the phase of absolutist police and military power. We may define this phase as that of Bonapartism. It is true that the victorious general has not yet made his appearance. In the meantime, Russia today is in its consulate, controlled by the two consuls, Lenin and Trotsky. End quote. Kautsky, Georgien, eine sozialdemokratische Bauernrepublik, 1921. In Kautsky's view, the comparison with French Bonapartism was to the advantage of Bolshevism. Bonapartism in France had represented a retreat from the preceding phase of the revolution, but it nevertheless represented, quote, some progress, unquote, for the rest of Europe, since it was an expansion of the most advanced state of continental Europe. The imperialist, quote, Bonapartism of the Bolsheviks, on the other hand, exported only its own political and social backwardness. Quote, the present Bonapartism of Moscow is reactionary, not only in comparison to the proletarian revolution from which it has emerged, but even more so in comparison to the proletarian movement in the rest of Europe, which it seeks to put in shackles to which no involved proletariat wants to submit, end quote. Kautsky, 1921. If Kautsky compared the Bolshevik to the Bonapartist regime, Kautsky saw Lenin as a sort of, quote, Bismarck of the proletariat, end quote. When Lenin died, Pansky Solsky, the Berlin correspondent of Izvestia, rather paradoxically invited Kautsky to write a commemorative article on Lenin for the newspaper of the Soviet government. After overcoming his great surprise at the request, Kautsky did write an article which was published in Izvestia with an editorial note affirming that even, quote, an open enemy of Leninism, like Kautsky, acknowledged, quote, the greatness of the genius of the proletarian revolution, end quote. In the compass of a text essentially devoted to Lenin as an individual, Kautsky rehearsed the main elements of his attitude toward, quote, Leninism as a historical current. In substance, Kautsky considered Lenin a gigantic historical figure, a great revolutionary who had also proved himself a great statesman, but of a state that had taken the road of, quote, fire and iron. While emphasizing and recalling his differences with Lenin, Kautsky saluted Lenin as, quote, a hero of the proletarian revolution, end quote. Quote, a colossal figure with few equals in world history, end quote. Among the great statesmen of the contemporary era, only Bismarck could compare with him. Divided in their historical objectives, the two men were motivated by an equal inflexibility of character and will. Like Bismarck, Lenin, quote, quite well understood the power of arms in politics, and Lenin could use arms in politics without scruples at the decisive moment, end quote. Like Bismarck, however, Lenin also understood the limits of the use of violence and was a, quote, master of diplomacy, the art of deceiving his enemies, of surprising them and exploiting their weak points in order to demolish them, end quote. But Lenin had another of Bismarck's qualities as well, the capacity to turn a new page when necessary. Quote, Lenin, like Bismarck, was always prepared, when he became convinced that the road he had chosen did not lead to his goal, to change directions and take another route. With the same facility with which Bismarck shifted from free trade to protectionism in 1871, Lenin turned from pure communism to the new economic policy. End quote. Kautsky. The grave limit of Lenin as a politician and a statesman, Kautsky continued, was his insufficient knowledge of the West, quote, even though he lived in the West for many years as an emigre, end quote. Quote, Lenin's policy, which fully corresponded to the specific conditions of Russia, was based in foreign affairs on the expectation of a world revolution, which from the outset appeared illusory to anyone conversant with Western Europe, end quote. Even within Russia, Lenin inevitably succumbed to the historical and social limits of the mass movement of 1917 and was compelled to contradict as a statesman the objectives Lenin had pursued as a revolutionary leader. The masses, powerfully stirred by the war, plunged into motion, and Lenin was supremely able to take advantage of their revolt. But the same masses, while they had the strength to shake the old order, were too backward and lacking in political and organizational experience to be able to construct a new order. Faced with this impasse, Lenin subjected the workers and peasants to a party dictatorship from which the toilers were unable to emancipate themselves. Quote, here, Kautsky asserted, quote, lie the deeper roots of the success of Lenin, and here also begin my greatest reservations about Lenin's system. For the liberation of the proletariat means above all the most limitless independence of the proletariat's thought and action, end quote. Kautsky. Instead of fostering these conditions which alone could prepare socialism, Lenin chose to exploit the weakness of the masses. Kautsky ended his article in commemoration of Lenin by expressing his faith that the Russian proletariat would find the strength to open a second phase of the Russian Revolution, one founded on democracy. For the historical contradiction of Lenin was that Lenin had, quote, led the proletarian revolution in Russia to victory, but also rendered it incapable of bearing fruit, end quote. Such was the fate of a socialist Kautsky, defined as a, quote, hero of the proletarian cause, despite their bitter differences. A year before, Kautsky had written a similar article commemorating the death of Martov, whom Kautsky considered the most positive exemplar of Russian socialism. Kautsky defined Martov as, quote, the leader of those who waged the struggle against Bolshevik Bonapartism even 20 years ago, when Bolshevism was still striving to erect its dictatorship in the party and not yet in the state, end quote. Kautsky. For Kautsky, Martov was the man who ideally should have triumphed one day, when a new democratic revolution had established a, quote, new proletarian regime, end quote, in Russia. Such a revolution, although not immediately predictable, was nevertheless a historic necessity, since the time during which Lenin appeared as the, quote, Messiah of Revolution, quote, Messiah of Russia, end quote, and Lenin's Russia as the, quote, Messiah of Europe, end quote, was now past. The success of Lenin, the statesman, had laid the basis for the success of Martov, the Marxist and socialist leader. New section. Section 5. Stalinism as Counter-Revolution. The, quote, fall of Trotsky in January 1925, climaxing the campaign launched against Trotsky in 1924 by the, quote, troika of Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Stalin, prompted Kautsky to further sweeping arguments in yet a new work, Die Lehren des Oktober-Experiments. This essay attempted an overall balance sheet of Trotsky's work, similar in substance, if not in form, to the article written about Lenin on the occasion of his death. Kautsky saw the internal conflicts of the Soviet leadership as confirmation of the position he had maintained up to that time. He had not asserted that in time the Bolshevik dictatorship would be reduced to a dictatorship of leaders. Had he not argued that without democratic institutions, political life would be reduced to a frantic struggle of factions within the leading group, while the proletariat, which according to socialist doctrine was responsible for the political and social administration of the new state, was eliminated from any role in events? Had Kautsky not charged that Bolshevism embodied the spirit of violent sectarianism, corrupt and corrupting, incapable of dealing with dissent except in terms of, quote, betrayal? For Kautsky, the, quote, major lesson of the October experiment, end quote, was that Bolshevism had created an oppressive machine that was now devouring its own creatures. Trotsky, along with Lenin, had certainly been the great hero of the October coup d'etat. The essence of the machine was that it functioned according to a single fundamental rule: deal with political questions through organized violence. Once erected into a system, the machine had acquired a technical independence of its own, and those who now controlled it could massacre those who had initially designed it. Quote, the despotism of the Bolshevik Party in Russia, end quote, wrote the aged theoretician, quote, today appears more solid and invulnerable than ever. Nevertheless, its framework is creaking. This has been proven very recently by the fall of Trotsky. At first sight, it may seem that Trotsky's swift and smooth liquidation has strengthened the dictatorship to the maximum, and has shown that no opposition to it is possible. But precisely the facility with which the opposition was defeated has demonstrated the extent to which Bolshevism has degenerated. For this was not an external opposition, but one that arose in its own ranks, an opposition led by a man who, with Lenin, had created the dictatorship and given the dictatorship its practical and theoretical foundation, while the greater part of the present bosses of Russia were initially hesitant and uneasy about it, and for good reason. End quote. Kautsky. And that's from what? Die Lehren des Oktober-Experiments, published in Die Gesellschaft 2, 1925. How then had, quote, Zinoviev and company succeeded in bringing down Trotsky? Kautsky posed a question that was often to be repeated by distinguished historians of Soviet Russia many years later. How was it possible that people so obviously inferior to Trotsky were able, quote, so rapidly and so easily, end quote, to defeat a man, quote, for all his weaknesses, stood head and shoulders above his Bolshevik opponents, end quote, and who enjoyed the prestige of one who had, quote, done so much for their state structure, end quote. Kautsky. Die Lehren des Oktober-Experiments, 1925. Kautsky's answer was that the fall of Trotsky was testimony to the internal contradictions of Bolshevism. As an oppositionist, Trotsky had been sacrificed to the machine Trotsky himself had played such a great part in creating. It was now quite clear that it was impossible in Russia, even within the Bolshevik leadership, to approach political problems otherwise than in terms of pure force, i.e. the material force that each contending side was capable of mustering. In a state dominated by the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy's repressive apparatus, in which it was not possible to wage a struggle for ideas through clashes of opinions as a normal and legitimate method, the only rule was the application within the party and the party's leading group of the violence that had first been set in motion outside the party against the other socialist parties, the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries. There was no longer any possibility of political initiative by the toiling masses, who had been entirely shunted aside. Quote, Trotsky himself made the greatest contribution to the construction of that frightful apparatus of dominant domination, which grinds up whoever dares challenge its masters, end quote. Kautsky, Die Lehren des Oktober-Experiments, 1925. Did I say Kautsky or Trotsky? I meant to say Kautsky if I said Trotsky. Maybe I did say Kautsky, who knows. This apparatus was in turn the produced product of the manner in which the Bolsheviks, guided by Lenin and Trotsky, had conquered power. They had conceived the seizure of power as a coup d'etat, conducted according to the rules of military art by a warlike vanguard, elevating the fruit of this pre-Marxist technique to an instrument of exclusive domination. Quote, Lenin and Trotsky, Kautsky wrote, quote, propagandized for the armed insurrection of their sect against the other workers' parties, as Trotsky himself admits, initially in conflict with another significant section of their own followers who were correctly concerned about this sort of civil war, until they themselves were unable to resist the fascination of power, end quote. Kautsky, 1925. Now a militarized system of power led inevitably, and Trotsky was the greatest exponent of this, to quote a military cretinist, end quote, conception of a task that could never be accomplished through violence or military spirit, social construction. Trotsky's was not a parliamentary cretinism, but a quote cretinism of a different type, military cretinism. Trotsky believes he can resolve all the problems of our time, end quote, above all economic problems, quote, with the instruments of military force, end quote. Trotsky's attempt, once in opposition, to escape from the implacable consequences of the power structure Trotsky himself had so notably contributed to creating, was inevitably condemned to failure by the, quote, contradiction of null consent, end quote. I don't know what that means. Let me look that up. I don't know. I'm not seeing anything come up. Anyway. To appeal to the right of criticism, as Trotsky belatedly did, was to recall a reality that Trotsky himself had reduced to a phantom when Trotsky was in power. Quote, so far, any attempt on the part of anyone who has fought for the Communist Party to exercise the right of criticism against the government has ended this way. Those who have made criticisms have been swept aside and reduced to silence, end quote. The machinery of despotism and repression, quote, transforms the champions of the ruling party into slaves and cowards, end quote. Kautsky, 1925. As we have already seen, Kautsky was gradually sharpening his polemic against Bolshevism, moving from a critique of Bolshevism as a, quote, error and, quote, deviation, to a position that considered Bolshevism plainly and definitively counter-revolutionary force. Already in the proletariat revolution of 1922, Kautsky set forth a, quote, logic of the development of the Bolshevik dictatorship, which would later serve to explain events like the internal struggle in the party leadership as the demonic triumph of a machine of terror and repression that would turn against the very people who had constructed it. Kautsky claimed that the Bolshevik Revolution was a bourgeois revolution waged by bourgeois methods, namely the struggle of an organized minority against a disorganized majority. In accordance with the historical logic of bourgeois revolutions, it found itself in the inevitable impasse of having to put an end to an abstract and ideological radicalism, which became untenable once real social conditions had reasserted themselves. The Bolshevik Revolution, however, had been marked by a significant variation with respect to the typical model of bourgeois revolutions. Generally, in past cases, the revolution of the radicals, who then proved unable to keep power, was succeeded by a counter-revolution led by a different, resolutely reactionary party. The historic peculiarity of the Bolshevik regime, however, was that this, quote, Bonapartist wave was generated not by another party, but by internal forces within the same party. Quote, although up to now, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, this process has occurred in all countries through the destruction and dissolution of one party by another. The Bolsheviks have themselves implemented the transition from revolution to counter-revolution. Astonished observers have lauded the vitality of their regime. But this rests not on the vitality of the revolution they have guided, but on the fact that the Bolsheviks, as soon as they noticed that the revolution was heading for defeat, unscrupulously assumed the functions of the counter-revolution themselves. End quote. Kautsky, the proletarian revolution. As time went by, Kautsky painted his panorama in ever blacker tints. In his 1930 work, Der Bolschewismus in der Sackgasse, he was still drawing the analogy between Bolshevism and Bonapartism. Shortly thereafter, in 1931, he proceeded to assert that Bolshevism was even worse than Bonapartism. In 1930, his concern was still to combat the view that the Bolsheviks were, quote, Jacobins, i.e. revolutionaries, possibly bourgeois, but nevertheless progressive. Parenthesis, as was maintained, for example, by Kautsky's old Austro-Marxist friends, such as Otto Bauer and Fritz Adler, end parenthesis. Quote, at the outset of their action during the Revolution of 1917, end quote, Kautsky wrote in this regard, quote, the Bolsheviks could perhaps have been compared to the Jacobins, although even then there were great differences. But after their coup d'etat, they departed even further from their original base, adopting overnight a program diametrically opposite to their previous program. The Jacobins never made such a turn. The Jacobins remained faithful to the idea of parliament and universal suffrage. It was thus not the Jacobins, but another party, although issued of the revolution and of Jacobinism, that showed no qualms about throwing their program overboard as soon as the opportunity to come to power and stay there in this manner arose. This was the party of the, quote, Bonapartists. If one wants to establish parallels between the last Russian Revolution and the first French Revolution, then the Bolsheviks must be compared not mainly to the Jacobins, but to the Bonapartists, end quote. Kautsky, Der Bolschewismus in der Sackgasse, 1930. This work will henceforth be referred to as, be cited as BS. That's funny because it's an abbreviation, but it sounds like a joke. And footnote. So that was a quote from 1930. In 1931, however, Kautsky announced, quote, Bolshevism is not Bonapartism. Bolshevism is worse than Bonapartism, end quote. For Bonapartism, quote, was counter-revolutionary only from the political standpoint, end quote. Bonapartism safeguarded and defended the, quote, economic base the revolution had created, end quote, and this allowed for the, quote, economic development of France, end quote. Quote, Bolshevism, on the contrary, has destroyed not only the political but even the economic conquests of the revolution, has subjugated the trade unions and factory councils, has enveloped the entire apparatus of production in the straitjacket of a bureaucracy, as incompetent as it is corrupt and arbitrary, and has thus condemned the economy to complete ruin, end quote. Kautsky. Sozialdemokratie und Bolschewismus in die Gesellschaft Number 8, 1931. The essential characteristic of the Soviet regime in the phase of, quote, Stalinism was henceforth its, quote, unlimited arbitrariness. This was the Soviet regime's most, quote, terrible aspect, which has debased the entire population, end quote. Kautsky, 1930. For years, Kautsky had been claiming that with its system of suffrage and ideology, Bolshevism had transformed the working class in Russia into a sort of, quote, aristocracy, in a decisive break with the Marxist program of using the socialist regime as a weapon to put an end to all class and corporatist privileges. Analyzing the USSR at the end of the 1920s, Kautsky drew a comparison between Soviet and feudal society. Compared to the great majority of the, quote, serfs, i.e. peasants who were excluded from any influence in the social system and reduced to a mere labor force. The wage workers, although haunted by insecurity and hunger, nevertheless maintained a position of miserable privilege. Quote, standing above the workers as in the countries under a feudal system, there is a high nobility in Soviet society. It is constituted by the Communist Party, which governs the state. Its members enjoy greater freedom and movement than the, quote, subjects. They can publish newspapers, make money, secure themselves a bourgeois lifestyle, ... The communists form the aristocratic class, which commands the rest of the population at will, of which it represents not more than 1%, end quote. The party rigorously supervised admission into its ranks in order to maintain its control, and, quote, one is never sure of remaining in those ranks, end quote, as was demonstrated by the continual, quote, purges. The, quote, Soviet aristocracy, composed of communists, had in turn only one guarantee of survival: loyalty to an omnipotent leadership, to a, quote, gang, which, quote, has established itself as the master of the entire Soviet apparatus, namely the army, the bureaucracy, the political police, and consequently dominates not only the trade unions and the Soviets, but even the Communist Party itself, in a dictatorial manner, i.e. through unlimited arbitrariness, end quote. Kautsky. The law of this absolute power was that it must purge itself ruthlessly. In this sense, quote, Soviet feudality was the embodiment of a much more complete despotism than that which prevailed under classical feudalism, whereas the feudal lords who inherited their property and commanded, quote, considerable rights, end quote, against the state could occasionally constitute a strong and independent position. The, quote, Soviet nobility was completely subjected to the despotic power of the leadership, while no relations other than those of force existed anywhere among the elements of Russian society. The Soviet Union was a land of unlimited arbitrariness. To those who expressed fears of a danger of Bonapartism in the USSR, Kautsky replied sarcastically, quote, what else does Stalin have to do to arrive at Bonapartism? Or would you assume there is no Bonapartism until Stalin has crowned himself Tsar? End quote. Kautsky. Where am I? 1930? Yeah, 1930. Having identified the Stalinist regime as counter-revolutionary and worse than Bonapartism, Kautsky, viewing socio-political systems through the prism of political and civil rights, of liberty of action for all parties, of full freedom for the organization of the proletariat and of the toiling classes in general, inevitably ended by assimilating Bolshevism to fascism as practitioners of similar political and governmental techniques. For Trotsky, Bolshevism could in no way be considered a sort of, quote, barbaric road to socialism. The essential point was not that Bolshevism was based on the nationalization of the means of production, and fascism on the capitalist mode of production, with private property of the means of production. It was rather that both infrastructures served to maintain a regime of despotic power that transformed the proletariat, and with it all society, into a completely subjugated mass. Kautsky's hostility to Bolshevism paralleled his hostility to fascism. In his view, there could be no reason to tolerate the former on the grounds that it had a proletarian base. Fascism also, he observed, possessed a significant proletarian component, which could not attenuate opposition to it. Just as a side from myself, Trotsky himself, dying in 1940, would say that Stalinism approached, was worse than fascism. Again, prior to the Holocaust and Barbarossa, which Trotsky didn't live to see. In his view, there could be no reason to tolerate Bolshevism on the grounds that it had a proletarian base. Fascism also, he observed, possessed a significant proletarian component which could not attenuate opposition to it. Footnote. Kautsky, Das Proletariat in Russland. In der Kampf number what's that? 1920. It says 1925, but I don't know. It feels like it might be later. There might be a typo. I don't know. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe it's 1935. I don't know. It says 1925 though, so I guess we have to roll with that. In substance, Kautsky believed that the fate of the proletariat would be the same under a Bolshevik and fascist regime. But the most serious charge Kautsky leveled at Bolshevism was that it had served as a school of repressive techniques for fascism itself. Quote, fascism in der Bolschewismus in der Sackgasse, quote, is nothing other than the counterpart of Bolshevism. Mussolini is simply aping Lenin, end quote. Kautsky. To be sure, Kautsky acknowledged that fascism was deliberately reactionary, while Bolshevism was reactionary as a consequence of Bolshevism's internal contradictions. Nevertheless, the ultimate results were not different as regards the position of the proletariat. Recalling the judgment he had made of Lenin in 1924, Kautsky admitted in 1931 that, quote, the will of the Bolsheviks is revolutionary, end quote, but added that, quote, their action is counter-revolutionary, end quote. Lenin concluded, quote, what counts for us in judging a party politically is not only the will of that party's leaders, but also and above all the inevitable results of their action, end quote. Kautsky. Thus, although Kautsky noted that in, quote, subjective will, the Bolsheviks differed from the fascists, this did not lead Kautsky to abandon his analogy. Quote, it is true that here, bracket, with the Bolsheviks, end bracket, the starting point was completely different than there, bracket, with the fascists, end bracket. Fascism shows that Bolshevik methods of dictatorship can be used either to enchain the proletariat or to enchain opponents. But when we compare them, we must note that what is inherent in fascism from the beginning as, quote, intention, namely the suffocation of all the freedoms of the workers' movement, represents the inevitable, quote, result in the case of Bolshevism, end quote. Kautsky. From politics, Kautsky turned to economics and the relationship between them. One of the roots of the mounting despotism exercised by the Bolsheviks over the proletariat, Kautsky argued, lay in their undemocratic and irrational management of the economy. In 1931, discussing the perspectives of the first five-year plan and the forced march industrialization of the USSR, Kautsky explained the essence of this irrationality as Kautsky saw it. Despite the fact that the Bolsheviks treated the writings of Marx as, quote, holy writ, and regarded themselves as Marx's only loyal followers, the Bolsheviks were adventurers in economic management who flouted all proper procedures. Quote, as good Marxists, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, they ought to be familiar with the second volume of Capital, wherein Marx explains that the relationships between the various branches of production must always be determined by the technical and social conditions characteristic of the particular conjuncture. Otherwise, the entire economic complex is thrown into disorder. A given quantity of means of production must be devoted to the production of means of personal consumption. Of these, in turn, one portion must serve for the production of foodstuffs, another for the production of cultural goods. A second great group of means of production must serve to produce new means of production, in order both to renovate outmoded means of production and to extend the compass of production itself. End quote. The Bolsheviks' economic policies, however, were not motivated by social purposes, but only by exigencies of augmenting their military strength. This was the fundamental genesis of the forced industrialization in the USSR, driven forward without regard to economic science or consequent social imbalances. Quote, now then, in what does the five-year plan consist? Nothing other than the most gigantic disruption of the proportionality required by the branches of production. What is valued above all else in Russia are the needs of militarism. The exigencies of production are not taken into consideration in the construction of new industrial complexes. To become independent of foreign industry for purposes of war, this is the greatest concern of the Soviet government in the construction of new industry. End quote. The Bolsheviks sought to achieve this objective regardless of, quote, economic and social costs, thereby fully revealing the non-socialist character of Soviet planning. For socialist planning was based on the simultaneous interaction of a number of fundamental variables that could not be divorced from one another: collective property, a high cultural and professional level, democracy permitting the harmonious control of diverse social exigencies, technical scientific planning. All these were lacking in Russia save one, the abolition of private property. Thus for Kautsky, Soviet, quote, planning was not planning in the socialist sense, but merely utilization of an entire state economy in the service of the despotic will and particular interests of a, quote, new ruling class, end quote. It's also important to note that Trotsky had a similar idea of the USSR, putting the USSR's, quote, planning in quotation marks. He viewed it as not really a planned economy, but as a bureaucratic economy. Hence, Soviet planning's scarcely, quote, scientific, capricious empiricism, an inevitable result of the lack of sufficient socioeconomic development in Russia. The despotic machine of the Soviet state, however, could afford to take no account of economic, social, or human costs. Quote, what we are now seeing in Russia, end quote, he wrote, quote, is not a planned economy, but an economy submitted to the uninterrupted alternation of plans, which has characterized Bolshevism ever since its inception. These are often grandiose projects, but every one of them is merely initiated. None is calmly carried through to the end. They are always continually modified, subject to patchwork and changes, until they are regarded as inadequate and either, quote, improved by new projects or laid aside, end quote. Kautsky. The sort of planning that prevailed in the USSR then was completely different from socialist planning. whose condition was the conscious intervention of the toiling masses in the labor process. In the Soviet Union, it was a minority that commanded the use of the means of production, a, quote, new class. Quote, when in place of the capitalists, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, there emerges another minority which commands the means of production independent of the population and often in conflict with the population. This change in property does not at all mean socialism, end quote. Kautsky. In reality, such a regime had not eliminated the reasons for the struggle of the proletariat. Since the working class remained excluded from power under the new regime, in fact, it created greater difficulties for the struggle of the working class than existed in the bourgeois democratic regimes of the West, where the masses enjoyed political and civil liberties, enabling them to struggle for change. In the USSR, on the contrary, they were subjected to a far greater oppression and lacked even the possibilities of struggle. Hence Kautsky's drastic conclusion, the new regime and the regime's new ruling class were worse than the capitalist system and the bourgeoisie. Quote, thus, what presently exists in Russia is not socialism, but socialism's opposite. Socialism can begin to be realized when the expropriators and usurpers who now hold power are themselves expropriated, as Marx said. The popular masses striving for socialism in Russia therefore find themselves facing precisely the same problems as exist in the capitalist countries as far as command of the means of production is concerned. The fact that the expropriators who must be expropriated in Russia call themselves communists changes nothing. The difference between Soviet Russia and Western Europe is only this. In the developed capitalist countries, the workers are already strong enough to impose various sorts of limits on the dictatorship of capital, and the relationship of forces is such that the socialization of important economic monopolies can take effect with the first parliamentary elections favorable to the workers. In Russia, on the other hand, the command of the means of production is not only centralized in a single body to the maximum, but is also supported by a state apparatus which is absolutized to the maximum. While, as we have seen, the workers are atomized, lacking free organization, a free press, or free elections, and completely incapable of resistance. Soviet Russia has certainly wrenched the means of production from the capitalists. Nevertheless, this has occurred in such a way and under such conditions that the capitalists have been replaced with even harsher and more powerful bosses, and even greater obstacles have been created to the proletariat's progress towards socialism than exist in the countries of developed capitalism, where democracy is deeply rooted, end quote. Kautsky. That's the end of this chapter. Thank you so much for listening.